Okay, so get this. Today we are diving into something both creepy and cool, serpent worship.
And, it's funny you should say that because when we say serpent worship, it's not like everyone had this, like, one big serpent fan club back in the day.
Right.
It's more like this ancient, I don't know, obsession with snakes that pops up all over the place everywhere,
Yeah.
from ancient Egypt to the Americas.
Yeah, it's like snakes were like public enemy number one, but also like the most intriguing thing ever
Right.
to our ancestors.
Totally.
So you shared some incredible excerpts with me from Serpent and Siva Worship, a book from 1877 by Hyde Clarke.
Totally.
And he really gets into how widespread this whole serpent thing really was.
It's true. And, here's the thing that I think is so interesting about it. It wasn't just groups that, I don't know, we might consider like quote unquote pagan today
Hmm.
who were into serpents back then. Even early Christians were using serpent symbols
Oh, really?
and even live snakes in their rituals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I did not realize that.
that's pretty wild.
Yeah, that's like a whole other level.
Right.
It makes you wonder, like, how deeply ingrained this whole serpent symbolism was way back then. Like, imagine, you go to church on Sunday
Right.
and there's a snake on the altar.
Right. It really challenges our modern perceptions, doesn't it?
Totally.
But even though serpent worship was this global phenomenon, the types of snakes that people worshipped were different.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the East, it was all about cobras and asps, but in the Americas, it was often the rattlesnake.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they were taking this universal symbol of the serpent and then they were like, okay, what's the most badass snake
Yes.
in my backyard?
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It was all about adapting that core idea that the serpent is this powerful, mystical being, but then fitting it to the creatures they saw around them.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
So speaking of origins, your source dives into some pretty wild theories about a group called the Adamites. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so these Adamites, as Clarke calls them, were this theoretical group that some scholars believe were like the OG serpent worshippers, the original serpent worshippers. And
Mhm.
get this, they think these Adamites might have lived in Central Asia,
Yeah.
which is really interesting because, Central Asia geographically connects cultures like the Chaldeans, the Hebrews, and even, get this, Native Americans
Mhm.
through serpent worship.
Wait, Native Americans, like here in like North America.
That's right. They use linguistics, ancient texts, like really trying to get in there, and even skull measurements to try and prove it.
Wow.
It's a controversial theory for sure.
That's wild. So we've got serpent worship happening all over the globe, maybe starting in Central Asia. But where does Siva fit into all of this? He's the Hindu god, right?
Yeah, so that's where things get really interesting. While we often associate Siva with Hinduism today, this deity, or at least variations of his name and his powers, pops up in some very, very surprising places.
Yeah.
Asia Minor, Greece, Central America, even Africa.
Really?
It's like he's a global superstar.
Like a celebrity almost. Wow. So you're saying Siva might be even older than Hinduism itself.
That's what the evidence seems to suggest. You know what's interesting? The earliest Hindu texts, they don't even mention him, which could mean that he was adopted into the Hindu pantheon much, much later from a much older belief system, one that's potentially tied to this, widespread serpent worship that we're talking about.
This is blowing my mind. Okay, so Siva, this ancient, possibly pre-Hindu god, is connected to serpents, but the serpent itself, in your source, seems to represent all these contradictions. It's linked to life and death, wisdom, and primal fear. Why do you think that is?
Well, you have to kind of try to think like our ancestors, right? Imagine seeing a snake. It's totally silent, it's deadly, and it sheds its skin like it's being reborn. It's easy to see how they might have viewed these creatures as having power over life and death, deserving both fear and respect at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. You don't want to mess with a snake, that's for sure.
No, no.
It's like this ultimate symbol of nature's power, both beautiful and terrifying.
Exactly.
And speaking of terrifying, your source mentions cultures where people actually believed they were descended from serpents.
It's true. The ancient Greeks wrote about the Scythians believing this, and then you also have several Native American cultures that have very similar stories.
Like who? Can you give us an example?
We've got the Aztec deities, Tanaquetzalcoatl, who is the male serpent son, and Cihuacotl, the female serpent. They're believed to be like the mother and father of humanity in Aztec mythology.
Wow, so instead of Adam and Eve, it's serpent mom and dad. That's one way to reimagine the family tree.
It really is. And it speaks to how absolutely central this symbol was to their entire worldview.
Hmm.
The serpent wasn't just some random creature. It was like the source of life itself.
It's wild to think that, like, even today with, all of our science and technology, snakes still have this, like, hold on us. I mean, look at us. We're still talking about them.
Absolutely. That fear, that fascination, it's hardwired into us.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how much of our view of these creatures today actually comes from these ancient beliefs that we're talking about.
Well, I mean, the Garden of Eden story definitely doesn't help. With the serpent and the apple and Eve, the whole thing, it's like the ultimate watch out for snakes story.
It's true, but it's interesting because even in that story, the serpent isn't exactly like pure evil.
Right.
It's more like it's pushing humanity toward knowledge, towards questioning the rules.
Which ironically connects to one of the serpent's biggest roles in a lot of cultures.
Yeah.
Wisdom.
Exactly. We often focus on, the danger, the poison, all that scary stuff. But they were also seen as these guardians of wisdom, of hidden knowledge. Like they had this deeper understanding of how the world worked.
Right. And your source even mentions, I love this, Jesus telling his disciples to be wise as serpents.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating?
It's like, what?
Right. It really is this powerful reminder that there's a lot more to this serpent symbolism than, what we might assume at first glance.
Totally. And it wasn't just wisdom that they were linked to. You were saying earlier that serpents were believed to have all sorts of powers.
Oh, yeah, they were like the ultimate multitaskers of the ancient world.
Okay, like what?
Okay, so for one thing, they were seen as bringers of rain and controllers of the wind, which, if you think about it, for our ancestors, weather was everything.
Oh, yeah.
Rain meant food. It meant life or death for your crops. And serpents, because of their connection to the earth, might have been seen as having influence over these really, really vital forces.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even today, you see that whole connection between snakes and weather in some cultures, like those dragon dances they do in China to bring the rain.
Exactly. And the dragon, which, let's be real, is basically a super serpent, is seen as this benevolent force that can, influence the weather for the good of everybody.
Right. So we've got rain, wind, wisdom. What else? There's got to be more.
Oh, there's more. Don't you worry. How about healing?
Okay.
Think about the rod of Asclepius, that staff with a snake wrapped around it.
Yeah, yeah.
It's still a medical symbol today, representing Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine.
Wow, I never knew that was a snake. Huh, you're right. These symbols, they really have stuck around for centuries.
That's really something.
It's almost like, they're like these little breadcrumbs connecting us back to our ancestors.
I love that.
And the way that they saw the world.
And that's what I think is so endlessly fascinating about serpent worship, right? It's not even really about literal snakes.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's about how human beings throughout history have tried to understand this universe that we live in, these forces that are way bigger than us. Yeah, totally. And so we use symbols, right? We use symbols to make sense of life, death, creation, destruction, all the big stuff.
The big stuff.
And it wasn't just about these big abstract concepts either.
Right.
Serpent worship was also deeply, deeply personal for people.
In what way?
It was about connecting with their ancestors, with the spirits around them.
Oh, interesting.
It was a way of honoring the past, of seeking guidance and protection for the people who came before.
I like that.
And I think it reminds us that, for our ancestors, that line between what's physical and what's spiritual, it was a lot more blurry than it is for many of us today.
It's like they thought spirits were everywhere, right? Animals, plants, the wind, the rain, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's like this enchanted forest all around them. And the serpent, with its, mysterious powers, this connection to the earth and the underworld and all that, would have been seen as this really powerful embodiment of that energy. It makes you think about how we relate to nature today, Do we give it the same kind of respect, the same reverence that our ancestors did?
That's a really good question. So we've gone deep on serpent worship here, but let's bring it back to the present for a second. Why should we even care about this stuff today? Like, it's not like we're all going to start, worshiping snakes anytime soon.
Well, I mean, maybe not.
Yeah.
But I think understanding these ancient beliefs, it can really help us appreciate how amazingly complex human thought is and always has been. It just shows us that people all over the world, throughout history, have been wrestling with these same big questions, right? Like, what happens when we die? What's our purpose? What's the point of it all?
Right. Like, where do we fit in
Exactly.
to the grand scheme of things?
It's fascinating, and it really puts things in perspective, don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
what seems totally normal to us today might seem totally bonkers to someone 1,000 years from now.
Yeah, totally. Like, we might look at serpent worship and think, what were they thinking? But people in the future might look back at our beliefs and just scratch their heads too.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder, what will they think about our religions, our science, our music, our culture? Will they be like, man, those people were onto something? Or will they be like, what a bunch of morons?
It's a question we can't answer, but it's definitely food for thought.
For
You're
sure.
right.
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic point to wrap up on. Thanks so much for taking us on this incredible journey into the world of serpent worship. I learned a ton.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
As always.
Always happy to geek out about this stuff with you.